Alright, hi everyone. I'm back home from work. Earlier this morning on my way to work, I started a conversation on the topic of basically the assumption that believing in God is intellectually inferior to being an atheist, which I feel like is a assumption I see a lot of atheists assume. So I was just addressing my thoughts. I'm also trying to simultaneously edit a video. Well, not really edit, but just get a video ready to be edited later today, because I'm always multitasking, because believe it or not, I actually always have a lot of stuff to do. And with my running 4 YouTube channels, there's always something for me to do, basically. So I need to edit another vlog today, so that helps me get caught up with my channels. Alright, but let's get into it. So I believe I left off talking about how there's a lot of faith. It takes faith to believe in science. Science, specifically on the topic of scientific theories such as evolution, and other concepts, I feel like, in the scientific realm that are used. They're widely believed, but they're also not actually proven. So that's what I'm referring to specifically, is these, oh gosh, not me not knowing where to start my vlog. Okay, that was me getting ready for bed. Okay, sorry y'all. I'm not doing a great job multitasking right now, but I'm trying. Alright. And it's just a weekend vlog I need to edit, and then I'll be done. Okay. I'm trying to remember my thought process. So I remember saying, basically, you have to have faith, put your faith in another man's intelligence to believe or trust science. So if you're someone whose belief system is based around scientific or science, you are basically putting your faith in another human's intelligence and their ability to understand the world around us. But the human that you are entrusting is not necessarily all-knowing. They also can't, they're also not certain about a lot of their beliefs, because science is a continued, right? And that was the other point I was making. Like, in order to trust science, you have to, which has also been wrong numerous times, you are trusting that the person before you was accurate and their understanding in order to continue your knowledge or understanding in the scientific world. So you're putting a lot of faith into someone else's perception, and also in someone else's ability to study and understand the world in order to continue science. So it's like, science is backed by, and also I understand like how scientific studies work and everything like that. It's like, I took the same science class as everyone else took. I'm not dumb. I understand the premise of scientific studies and everything else. And honestly, my favorite subjects in school were math and science. Although I did a bit better in my English and history classes. I was really good at writing papers, and I think that comes from my mom, who writes grants for a living, by the way. or used to. She's retired. But I always really enjoyed math and science classes. One of my favorite classes I took in high school was actually microbiology. But anyways, I think, again, I'm really just addressing the assumption that belief in science is somehow superior to a belief in God. And I'm just pointing out that you have to have faith to trust science. You have to have faith to trust science, and you also have to have faith to believe in God. In both cases, you're trusting something you did not see, you do not know, things that you cannot be seen, things that cannot be proven beyond a shadow of a doubt, right? So faith means you're trusting something without fully knowing it's true, but you have faith that it's true, or you have a strong belief in that thing even though it hasn't been proven. And I'm saying, like, someone who believes in evolution is believing, like, no one observed evolution. Not one human being on the planet observed evolution. It's a theory. It's a theory that has a lot of holes, by the way. I feel like people who are ready to believe in evolution but don't acknowledge the holes in that theory. I personally think, like, DNA, in my opinion, makes evolution almost impossible. Understanding genetics, in my personal opinion, because your DNA is a code that is always, it's specific, it's order, there's a law to it, and it's too specific. There's so much information in your DNA, and something having, and I get, like, the concept of evolution, having, you know, genetic mutations don't often end in degradation, not improvements. So the theory of evolution kind of has a main basis on, you know, needing these genetic mutations in order to form new things, but understanding how your genetic code actually works. It's kind of like the more errors there are in your genetic code, the less likely you are to exist. And we really don't see a lot of genetic mutations that necessarily would lead to speciation. I think macroevolution is proven. Microevolution is the one that's proven. Macroevolution is the one that has a lot of questionable concepts within them. Also knowing, like, even within a species, you can have too much genetic mutations that something won't exist. If there's too many differences, and there's enough differences between species, that's what results in speciation, right? Like, it's not possible for a human being to carry anything but a human being. And I know and this is the biggest, I think this is probably the biggest kicker to the idea of evolution. Like, the only time that there's been successful genetic mutations or speciations, like when people create ligers or splice together different species to create something else, it took someone outside who understood the genetic code in order to create that new species, right? Like, someone outside of that species who understood the necessary things required to create that species in order for that new species to be created. Like, it never happens in nature or on its own. I mean, there's very few instances of it occurring naturally. Thinking of, like, there's people in China supposedly trying to mix different species DNA to create a new species, which I do believe is evil, but we're not going to get into that. But anyways, it took someone outside of those things to create that new species. It's not occurring naturally, and someone who understood it and existed outside of it was the only way it was able to create something new. So keep that in mind, because your genetic code can only ever create a human being naturally within nature. Your DNA does not just randomly start to create a random species. And how your genetic code works, even in the womb, if there's too many errors within your genetic code while you're in the womb, you won't exist. Like that, it's not a viable pregnancy. It won't even result in you being born or in a life existing. So there's too many specific things that have to happen. There's too much specifications within a species genome in order for it to make sense that speciation could occur over time. I also want to say this. A lot of science uses the aspect of time, or the concept of time, throws time at the problems that they can't actually prove. So in theory, they're basically using, oh, well, we can't prove it, but it's possible over time. You know, time, people say God of the gaps, but atheists or scientists often use time to explain away the problems that they can't actually prove scientifically. They just say, well, it's possible over time. So you put faith that time makes all things possible. Time in of itself does not actually exist, which is the other problem. Time is a concept. So saying that time alone has the ability to make things happen, I feel like is also not a truthful idea, because time is a concept that we use to understand the world. Time does not actually exist. It's relative. But that's another topic. Anyways, let's get back into the original thing I was talking about, which was, I think when I think about it, when I rationalize it, I just think to myself, would I rather put my faith into someone else's, another human being's intelligence who was not there at the beginning of the time? Or would I rather put my faith that there is someone who knows more, all-knowing, all-powerful, intelligent, who claims, like God claims, that he created all things. God also claims to be the beginning and the end. God also claims to be like the first being, and he's also alive. These are all these three things are super important when it comes to like understanding science as well, because they're the concept of spontaneous generation or something. It was just basically the idea that you can get life from non-life was disproven, right? So everything that's alive could only exist because there's something living before them. But without God, there's no proof of a living being. I do think people have argued that the universe is alive, but I don't know how far that theory went. Oops. I'm not sure how far that theory went, but I do think that was like an argument they were trying to make to, you know, prove where life began, because basically biogenesis makes it very clear that in like all living things, like you can't have a living thing without life. Like, what was the first life and where did it come from? Because it has to come from something that's already living. And that's a big problem, I feel like, in the scientific world that does not get addressed enough. But that problem doesn't exist because God is living. When you believe in God, it's like, okay, well, God is the first being to exist. He's all knowing. He's infinite, right? And God being infinite is super important when it comes to the story of creation, because the universe has a distinct beginning. That's scientifically, I guess, proven. And if there's a beginning, that means the universe isn't infinite. It didn't always exist, which means something had to exist before the universe. Because again, believing in only science, you have to believe everything existed out of nothing. And that's not really a logical concept that I could get behind personally. But anyways, my biggest thing when I just thought about it was, okay, there has to be someone who knows. I also think there's so much order and law. There's so much law and order within our world, within the universe, things follow these laws. And the mathematical equations that people have come up with to study, gravity, to study all of these forces that exist in our natural law, there's laws in nature, right? Where do these laws come from? These laws created themselves out of nothing. That doesn't really follow logically. I guess it really just happens. To me, science on its own, you have to believe in a lot of things that, in my opinion, don't logically follow. Is law and order created out of randomness and chaos? If you were to, like, even if you think about someone who's coding something like for a website or whatever, that person is not just putting a bunch of random 0 1s and to create whatever program they're reading. They're intentionally putting a code. They're following a language. They're using something. It took a brain. It took a mind. It took intelligence in order for a program to follow these laws and rules in order. A coder is not just randomly typing in a bunch of things and saying, well, this will just I can do out of randomness, order and laws will be created. They have to intellectually design the properties and functions of this program in order for it to, work and run okay. And if there's a bug or something, if there's any type of error, that degrades the function of the website and that creates, errors within being able to use it. So if that's true for a code, for a program, why does that not apply to the laws and order in the universe and the very real mathematical equations that exist within our world? It's also, it's like so much things have to come together in order for you to exist, which even just using statistics should be impossible, which also doesn't make sense out of, if math is true, right, then nothing should exist. None of us should exist based off of the mathematical equation of the probability of all of the things that had to happen at random in order for this entire universe and people and the planet, the animals, everything to exist at random. None of this should exist. Anyways, God also is intelligent. Like, that's the other part of it too. Like, in order for us to be intelligence, where does intelligence come from? Scientifically, intelligence can't be proven, but every person doing science believes in intelligence, right? Like, you have to trust that you have a way of knowing and understanding, that you can trust your mind and you can trust your observations, and that what you think actually has a real meaning and is truth. So in order to do science, you have to believe in intelligence. But if you believe in intelligence, intelligence doesn't exist in a world created at random. Where does intelligence come from? How do you prove intelligence? That's also another problem for, I guess, an atheist. Anyways, there's just a whole lot of things, in my personal opinion, that science cannot explain. Science won't ever have all the answers. I don't think science has the capability of answering all the questions because, again, we created science. Science was created by humans who are limited in their knowledge of the world. I'm like, the fact that we have science to begin with is because we don't know and we don't understand our world. We created science because to understand ourselves, to understand the plants and the animals and how everything worked, because we did not know that. Like, I just want to make it very clear, we didn't create the problems and the laws and the order. It's like when science discovers something new, people try to credit the scientist as if the scientist created it. But that thing that they're discovering existed before that scientist knew what to call it or knew how to name it. And if there's intelligence within what we're discovering, then there has to be an intellectual being that was capable of creating that. Because otherwise we're saying intelligence is a random thing that just happens to exist in our world but doesn't require a mind. but even in our actual understanding as human beings, the intelligence that we have as humans required a mind, but the intelligence that we discover in the universe doesn't require a mind. Like, how does that make sense? How do you conceptualize that? Like, how can you conceptualize studying a world that is so complex that you have to study it for thousands of years to even understand it, but can't conceptualize that a world that has this much intelligence and this much order and this much laws ingrained within it can't have an intellectual being behind it? Like, how do you ignore the what you're studying is very intelligent, and intelligence requires a mind, and a mind requires a life, right? Something living has to have, in order to think, you have to have a mind. In order to have a mind, you have to be alive, right? I don't know of a non-living being that has a mind, right? I don't know. It just goes really deeper into how you, like, if people, I don't know. This is why I say question everything. Like, it's easy to just believe everything that science tells you, but I personally just would not put all of my eggs into trust the science, especially knowing how many times science has been wrong. Now, on the other end of things, there's been a lot of things that science has proven that's in the Bible that science has eventually shown to be true, which is actually kind of ironic. Like, a book written 2,000 years ago, 3,000 years ago, still has been right about a lot of things that people questioned or didn't believe. So yeah. What's the other thing I was gonna say? I think at the end of the day, when it comes down, would I rather put my faith into an all-knowing intellectual God who claims to have created everything, that knows everything, that formed everything, that knows the details down to the number of hairs on every person's head? Would I rather trust that there's someone greater than the human beings that existed who can say for sure what happened at the beginning? I would rather put my faith in God than put my faith in another human being that didn't create the world. At the end of the day, it's just like I feel like you can, like, whether or not you believe the world was created or not, that comes down to faith at the end of the day. What you believe, how you believe the world began is a faith question. It's not really a scientific question, because again, in order for it to be scientific, someone had to have observed it. And based off of science itself, there was not any human beings around at the beginning of the world. So how can a human being actually fully know what happened at the beginning? The theories that exist, yes, there's theories that humans have come up with. How do we know? But they're not proven beyond a shadow of a doubt. So again, faith. Second part is, if humans don't understand that, then how can you're trusting someone else's intelligence and understanding of the world versus the belief that there's someone who actually does know. Like, do you think that it's impossible to know? But the world is already exists, right? Whether we existed or not, the world existed. Let me fix what I'm saying. So, whether or not you believe God exists or God created the world, you still have the problem of the world that we live in and that already exists. Whether we understand it or not, it exists. And if we didn't create it, if we didn't design it, there has to be a truth to how it was created. The atheist version of that has a lot of holes, right? But to me, I feel like as Christians, and I guess this is where it's like I differ from a scientist, I don't feel like I need to know how the world was created at the end of the day, or the beginning of the world. And I think I talked about it before. I feel like the eighth science the science that we have now, I do feel like has been overtaken by a lot of atheists. And so the assumption that God has nothing to do with the beginning of the world only was normalized because atheists essentially took over the science behind the scientific studies, and so they have a bias against God. But then you have the intellectual design argument that I feel like has also more recently come into place, because again, there's too many processes that are intellectual, and there's too many processes within our world that require an intellectual mind. Like things, like nothing gets designed out of, there is not one thing that human beings have created that someone would argue just came to exist out of nothing and from nowhere. Like, even something, and I always make this argument, something as simple as a chair, we would not argue that this chair just came to exist out of nothing and from nowhere. And we would argue that someone designed that chair with a purpose, with a function. It took a mind. Someone designed that chair. Someone put it together. Someone found the pieces. Like, it took a lot of intelligence for a chair to be created or to come to exist. But then people will believe that the entire physical world that we live in can just come to exist out of nowhere. I don't think that's an honest, intellectual, honest argument. I think that's an argument people make because they don't want to believe in God. Not because God doesn't actually exist, but because they want to find a way that the world can exist without God, without a creator, because they don't want to believe in God. I honestly think, logically, I'm think like, if a chair has to have a creator, if every physical thing that is around us, right? Except for the earth, everything that humans have created, buildings, books, I don't know, it's just like every physical thing has to be created, but we'll argue that the entire world and the entire universe wasn't created, even though there's infinitely times more knowledge and more complexities within the physical world than the things that we created as humans. I just feel like it's logically follows, if there is so much complexities within our world that we have been studying it for thousands of world and have barely touched the surface of it, there has to be somebody someone has to know. And I just believe that someone is God. Why? Because God claims to be the creator of all things, and also claims to be all-knowing, and also claims to be infinite. If I might not know it, but I trust that God does, right? And that's just, again, how I personally think about it. But everyone is entitled to their opinion. I really just don't like the kind of assumption of, in order to believe in God, you're just not intelligent, or it's like an intellectually inferior opinion to hold, or to believe in God. I just don't think that that's the right way to assume. Now, I don't think you don't have to be a genius to believe in God, but I also think like the actual thing that stops a lot of atheists from believing in God is their pride in their own knowledge and understanding. A lot of times, like, I don't think you can be too smart to believe in God. I just think you can be too prideful to admit that there's someone who knows more than you, because you want to be the smartest thing on the planet. You want to think of yourself as having all the answers, as having all this knowledge. But as a Christian, or when you believe in God, I don't think of myself as being this super intelligent being. I think of myself as being a creation. Like, God created me, God designed me, God formed me. I think of God as being the greatest thing. So it's just like, I don't put myself on the pedestal or put human intelligence as being like the greatest thing of all time, or even just intelligence. And also the Bible says like human knowledge is worthless, which is actually funny because it's true to a certain extent, because how can we know really know something if you didn't create it? I think the person who is most knowledgeable on something is the person who created it. But since not one scientist actually created the world, why are we acting like someone who studied the thing can know more than the person who created it? And again, not believing the world created is not necessarily a logical argument. It's really just one of, you don't want to believe in God. You don't want to believe in an intellectual being designing the world because I don't know. Personally, I really don't. I would have to ask, like, someone else would have to explain it to me. The reason you don't want to believe in God is personal to you, not really personal to me. But I don't think a belief in God is intellectually inferior, nor do I think a belief in God cannot be logical, because again, the only logic I really think of is if it takes logic and intelligence for me to create a chair, why would that not apply to the entire physical world? And just because a human didn't create the physical world doesn't mean that someone didn't. And God is also a personable being. Like, I know a lot of people try to say like, oh, it's just the universe, and they worship the universe because they don't necessarily want to believe in God, but they also understand that there has to be some sort or form of higher power, and they will just call it the universe. But the universe is an object, right? It's not personable. It doesn't have a mind. God is personable. God has a mind. God is living. That's like the most important thing I honestly think about too. Like, the God that Christians serve is the living God. He calls himself the living God. All of them other gods that people worship are not living. They're dead. Where's Zeus? Where's all these other gods other people worship? I don't know. But I also think knowing that it takes life to create life, how does life exist without a living being? And who is that living being if not God? That science are going to tell you. What was the first living being? And they'll say it's like a bacteria. But where did that bacteria get life? Where did it come from? Because there has to be an origin. Life did not create itself out of nothing. The world did not create itself out of nothing. But that's what you honestly have to believe as an atheist, which in my opinion is not a very solid worldview. So yeah, that's my thoughts I'm going to share. And yeah.